Good afternoon. I would just like to extend a special welcome to Tom Stewart's socks. Can I just get a sense of the room in terms of how many people have been here since Monday? Wow,
that's pretty good.
You are amazing.
Yeah.
Since Tuesday? Okay, the Mondayites. God, talk about resilience.
Or just, resistance.
Resistance.
Persistence. Persistence.
And how many of you are continuing on for the symposium tomorrow that you know of? Okay, so a good sprinkling. Okay, good. That's a nice sense of the room. We do have a game plan for this panel, but my theory is that no game plan survives first contact with the enemy. I mean the panel. The idea at the audience. The idea is that we start with a conversation. We have a plan. Some opening statements from the panelists, which should move into a conversation. We hope, and I'm hoping that we will have two sort of intervals where we can take questions about halfway through and at the end. So that's the game plan. I would like just to say a word or two about where I think that your particular contributions come from. I may get it completely wrong. Feel free to contradict. Alicia, you come out of a sort of philosophy background, and your seminal contribution to the sort of area of systems thinking, complexity thinking, is the idea that we have a lot of mental baggage which constrains how we think about the world and how it works. It's overly simplistic, and that means that we are constantly being outwitted by the world, that the world is much more complex than we actually treat it when we're planning and organizing the way that we work. Dave, you took a lot of that insight, and you've been spending the last 20 years or so developing methods and approaches for helping organizations and governments, even larger organizations, apply that insight to thinking and planning and implementing change. He's got an eyebrow.
Yes, two.
And Tom, you've spent the last 30 years or more helping organizations make sense of themselves, particularly in relation to knowledge and intellectual capital, and more recently, markets and market sectors make sense of themselves. So I thought that might be useful as a framing for perspectives that you bring for the audience's sake. Our opening question was, why should we care about complexity? Tom, could I start with you?
Sure. As Jane said, I am now at, she left out at the Ohio State University. And I grew up in the Midwest. And those of you who know the Midwest know that its land is laid out in grids, in sections, townships 6 miles square, and 36 sections of 1 mile square in each one, laid out by surveyors who went over this roughly flat landscape, but not entirely flat landscape, and superimposed a grid to simplify it and to design where roads might be and where farms might be and how markets and other things might be set up. It is, of course, a fiction. It is a superimposition of a simplification and a fiction over a landscape that is much more complex, rich, and so on than any mapping of it can do. It is also a useful fiction. It is. I don't want to say that it is a useless fiction, but it is a fiction. I think most organizations are similarly set up with lines and boxes and have been set up that way for a long time. And most of the work that we do is we decompose the job of producing something to sell to someone into a set of functions, departments, actions, into a grid of 1 mile by 1 mile, and put those up into 6 miles by 6 miles, and connect roads between them on the box, and so on and so forth. And it is a useful fiction. But it is a fiction, and it doesn't get at the real work. I think about 25 years ago was the first time I ever saw someone present a slide that said, 10 years ago, organizations were hierarchical. Today, they're flat. 10 years from now, they will be networked. I have seen that slide for 25 years. Now, not only is it the other underlying piece of this is that the actions that we do to produce things of value to people who want to pay for them are increasingly not industrialized, cookie-cutter mass production actions. That kind of fiction works a lot better if you are cranking out however many Model T Fords you want in any color so long as it is black. But if you are trying to deal with a whole bunch of patients in a big city tertiary care hospital, each one of whom has different situation and different problems, those lines and boxes become divergent from reality. If you were trying to do complex sales as opposed to order taking, those lines diverge from reality. So I think complexity matters because the world, we have to address those useful simplifications are no longer enough, and part because we're getting good at them, but also in part because the landscape has become ever more complex.
Dave?
I think a range of reasons. I mean, first of all, this is the first time we've brought natural science into management science really since the turn of the last century. And that's actually quite important because that gives us a solid base for what we do. I actually had the privilege of teaching leadership with Peter Drucker on 3 occasions. And one of the conclusions we both came to is that scientific management and complexity thinking have more in common with each other than either does with systems thinking. Because whereas in scientific management, people were automating what they could automate, but they left apprentice models of leadership in place. What systems thinking consistently tried to do was to actually get rid of leadership, was to get rid of process, to force people into these highly engineering constructs from which you couldn't escape. So for me, that's one critical reason. I think the other thing is that one of the things that complexity teaches us is you can't change the dispositional system by big vision statements.
What do you mean by a dispositional system?
Okay, so a complex system, it has dispositionality. So I can basically say it is currently disposed to evolve in these directions. It may not evolve in these directions, but I can never say something with certainty.
Okay.
And that contrasts with material linear causality, which basically says I can determine an outcome.
Okay.
Now, the key thing to understand, let's take climate change at the moment, which is something we've got a project on at the moment. Yeah. So the minute you announce these big issues, negative or positive, in 10 years' time, if we don't do something, the planet is over. Well, kind of like it's probably true, but that basically means that nobody feels. You remove agency from people, so they ignore it. And that's just human nature. Remember, we're bringing together cognitive neuroscience with anthropology, with complexity science. You actually have to give people agency in something they can do in the short-term present before you change the dispositional state so that people will accept the bigger vision. And that's absolutely critical in climate change. But you see the same problem in organizations. They always start with the big vision about the future state. And this is the engineering metaphor, which has dominated the past 4 decades. Engineers want to know what to build. They want you to remove ambiguity. So what they do is, and you see this with Peter Senge as well, he's the soft end, Hammer and Chamfrey are the hard end. They manage things by defining where they want things to be, and they ignore where you start. And the really important thing about complexity is we manage the evolutionary potential of the present, rather than trying to define idealized future states. And the key phrase on that is we start journeys with a sense of direction, but we don't have too many specific goals. Because if you're dealing with a system with inherent uncertainty, goals are very dangerous because they blind you to possibilities. If you have a sense of direction and you remain open, then you can see emergent possibilities as they come.
Okay, so emergent possibilities as they come, and I think there's probably a connection with what you said, Tom, about things are just getting more uncertain and all the time. That all of those dynamics seem to be becoming more complex and more uncertain as time goes on. So keeping track of emerging things seems to be figuring out what's going on as you
and
move.
managing the disponentiality, or identifying the dispositionality so that you can sort of shape it.
Yeah.
Which seems cognitively quite challenging to do, but we'll come back to that. Alicia.
That's an interesting.
I think that from a philosophical point of view, Patrick's point about the baggage we bring to issues and problems has to do a lot with what Tom just said about the grid. And I think one of the reasons is that for a long time we've ignored context. And that goes back to Galileo, if you will, when he was studying a ball rolling down an inclined plane. Well, you know you can ignore friction. Well, yes, in principle you can ignore friction in some systems, but friction comes back and bites you. And so as a result, and the reason why I think Dave brings in natural sciences is that the discipline that was the most recalcitrant at being shoehorned into that grid mentality, that model of cause and effect as billiard ball, push-pull phenomenon was biology. And biology just resisted it and resisted it. But biology 200 years ago was just classification for a while, and there was no basis to it.
Taxonomy boot camp. People have been
Well,
here
that's
since,
why I hesitated.
since
I didn't-
Monday.
that's
You used the word just.
No. Well, because I think it was classification on the basis of maybe appearance, or instead of classification on the basis of underlying dynamics in the relationship between the
Taxonomy, not typology.
Yes, that's right.
Taxonomy, not typology.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
And that's what interests me in particular, because if we think of ourselves as being embedded in a context, and I use the word embedded very deliberately because I really want to contrast it with just being plunked into something. When you're embedded, you have all those lines of interaction and they're tangled interdependencies that really embeds us in a context.
Just to interrupt, just to get this, but we also have trajectories.
Yes.
Right. So
yes, and
just
the constraints at one level can create the trajectory of the overall system, right. And vice versa, the constraints that we find ourselves as members of that community, as embedded in that context, simultaneously constrain our capacity to maneuver, our capacity to adapt. Right. And philosophy and sciences have had a very difficult time understanding inter-level relationships. Philosophers have this awful term, mereology, and that is parts interacting to produce wholes, which in turn loop back down to affect their parts. Philosophy and science aren't comfortable with that. We're comfortable with billiard ball, push-pull, mechanistic type of causality.
But isn't it, I mean, one of the reasons why we do taxonomies is to simplify, and why we build grids is to simplify, right? Useful fictions, to simplify the environment so that we can deal with it, because we have small brains.
Absolutely, no.
So let's go back to this idea that...
actually fundamentally disagree with that.
Excellent.
Yeah, we don't have small brains, yeah? We actually have brains which are more than capable of handling high levels of uncertainty and ambiguity. Yeah, what we're actually doing is restricting how we see through things through simplistic grids. Human beings evolved to handle high levels of uncertainty in clan and tribe-like structures. And we're really good at that.
And we're good at pattern recognition.
And we're good at pattern recognition.
Yes,
So, the danger is you confuse simplicity with simplistic.
At the same time, we are operating at different levels. If you take the Cynefin framework, that says we're operating at different levels all of the time. There are elements of simplicity and predictability.
Yeah, and it basically says the boundary conditions are key, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, it's quite interesting if you look at this. I mean, there are two major changes in science which are fascinating. One happens with Descartes. So Descartes is scared shitless of what the Catholic Church are going to do to him. So he basically separates the brain...
let
me finish the point.
Scared shitless?
scared shitless of what the Catholic Church may do to it.
Technical term.
It's a technical
Yes,
term.
it's a technical term.
Okay.
Okay. This is philosophy, Patrick. Catch up, all right? So basically, what Edie says is by separating the brain from the body, he creates a space for science and a space for the soul. And a huge amount has gone with that since. So we get these Cartesian concepts of consciousness, which imply that the brain has to direct the body. Now we know from a whole body of work, not only is the body as a part of our consciousness, but from Clarke's work, the narrative structures and the social constructs are part of our extended consciousness. And it's because we can operate at that level, we're natural complexity thinkers. What's happened in business for the past 50 years is an attempt to reduce our natural capacity into boxes.
Yes, but there's clearly a driver and a motivation for doing that.
Well,
That's what I'm
and
trying
that
to get
driver
at.
and motivation is to get things done,
Right.
right?
Exactly.
I mean,
And it works.
and a sense of efficiency that sometimes says, gee, doesn't the ocean have a lot of redundant drops?
I like that.
So you know, and to some extent, you know, if you know what you are doing, if you are in one of the Kneffen boxes that is rule-based and
not a box.
and simply, or yes, domains, that is definitely not. It is a box, but the cat in the box is of indeterminate viability.
Live ended.
All right. Did you,
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, if we're getting on the show together, that's
All
all
right,
different.
but if you're in one of those domains, that works. But the problem is that if you're in one of those domains contextually, you may not be aware that when you're of the fact that it's no longer working. I mean, General Motors was going to hell, which is another scientific term, for about 30 years before they figured it out. Even though people on the outside had figured it out. So you get in one of those things, you know, this is fine, this is, boom, boom, boom. And that's part of it, I think
Yeah, I think that there's another thing which is useful here. There's a thing which came about the last 20 years called constructor theory in physics, which actually has less relevance in physics, but a huge amount of relevance in social science. So it's an attempt to address physics as a whole, not on an atomistic basis. So the basic assumption is physics isn't about what's the smallest possible particle, then assembling, which, I mean, quantum mechanics says is wrong anyway, but never mind that, right? What Dukas and his colleagues at Cambridge did, they said we actually need to look at the system as a whole. So what you basically say is, what do the laws of natural science create as a constraint? Then within those constraints, you look at what produces the lowest energy gradient. So the example you use is, you know, the moon has a high energy gradient, a satellite has a low energy gradient, so satellites are more likely to be created than moons. But they both suffer the laws of gravity. Now that's actually key to understanding organizations. You need to work out what the natural science constraints are on human cognition, system dynamics, etc. Within those constraints, whatever has the lowest energy gradient, which is another way of saying dispositional state, will happen. So if you actually want to change things, you have to change the energy gradients, not change the objective. And that's actually really important to understand because it's all about changing interactions and time, and it's the fitness landscapes stuff we talked about. It's understanding what the lowest energy gradient is and how to change the energy so undesirable things are more difficult and desirable things are easy.
Yeah.
Okay, but let's come back to this motivation and driver, this sort of sense that we just need to get things done and I don't want to be bothered with all of this. What was the...
Well,
oh, no, you didn't use that term.
people are messy. If I'm a manager, I don't want to deal with your personal life, you as a human being. That's hard.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
but
agree.
you're used to it.
But I want to come back to the idea of baggage.
Yeah.
Well, but the baggage is all of these mindsets and all of these ways of thinking. And in biology, we've learned an organism and a species will tend to exploit its environment until it starts reaching the end of its adaptive space.
Right.
So while you still have plenty of room to maneuver, your best use of your resources is efficiency. Mm-hmm. As soon as you start reaching the boundaries of your area of adaptability, then the strategy should change to increasing capacity. Right. If you start if you continue to improve efficiency, General Motors, when they are at the edge of their boundary of adaptability, then they're throwing good money after
You have
bad.
just summarized Michael Porter's What is Strategy and his argument about the productivity frontier within which efficiency works, but out there you have to do different activities or do activities fundamentally different.
And
So
they-
what's fascinating is that those
I'd
of you
agree
who don't
that,
know the
but I think-
biology but know the Porter, it's a map.
And that's why we learn, as Dave said, instead of looking at physics as our model, looking at biology and ecology, I think, are a lot more useful.
But I think there is a
It's a lot
problem
more
with Porter. Porter is the archpriest of systems thinking in terms of strategy. And I think we can get more extensive. If you look at Clayton Christensen's work, right? What he basically says is companies fail not because they're incompetent, but because they're too competent.
Oh, absolutely.
Now that's actually critical to understand. This is what we call apex predator theory. So basically you get two moments. Yeah? We got what we call the exaptive moment, the moment at which the old way of doing things is running out of steam, but it's so dominant it's difficult for something new to enter.
Correct.
And companies who make the change then have strategic dominance. So you see this when Microsoft replaces IBM, you see it when Apple replaced Microsoft. And I could give you many other examples. Then you get the point of competence-induced failure, by which whole industries disappear. And it's a very narrow window. And this is a key thing on the modern concept of strategy, which Porter doesn't get. Because Porter doesn't understand that strategy is specific to context. He sees everything as natural cycles, and it isn't. There are times when things can change and times where they don't. There are times when efficiency works, there's times when effectiveness works. And it's that ability to have that situational awareness to know when things could change,
Right.
which is what this is
Right.
about.
And if you're at the center of your range of adaptability,
You can't do it.
then you just exploit it and you're the
That's
top
it.
of the heap.
So-
But if you're at the edge, then it is not advisable. It is imperative to take risks, to see where the next adjacent possible.
Okay, so I just want to signal that I want to ask a question, and then I want to open the floor to questions, so that you have time to come up with smart questions,
Or dumb.
or actually dumber
There's
is
no
better.
such thing as a dumb question.
Oh,
Well,
ones
yes,
that
yes, I taught
Patrick
for
thinks are dumb, but
31
we
years.
think are
There
smart.
are a
Those
lot
are
of
okay as well.
Right, those are okay.
But my question is this idea of sensing that you're reaching the edge of your adaptive space. I mean, that's what drives the realization that we should start thinking in complexity-oriented ways. Is it easier for that to happen at a societal level than
Nice.
within an organization?
Nice.
I actually think it's impossible at both, unless you consciously trigger people to realize the world has changed. The problem we got at the moment is that if you look at this historically, the system fails. This is why I intensely dislike people who talk about the forest cycle, because it basically says we have to go into chaos to recover. Now that was okay until about 50 years ago. We can't do that anymore. So we've got to find ways to actually break that cycle without going into chaos. And that means, and that's where actually AI, if it's used properly, could be hugely powerful. But its current use is to create a swarm intelligence. And with all due respect to other presentations, an entire focus on written text and AI is one of the ways that we destroy humanity. Because basically, computers are better at that than we are. And what we're going to face is a swarm intelligence of AI bots rather than something was inhuman. Unless we make the change, that's what's going to happen.
Okay, just to do a cortex on that. When you say "with all due respect," sorry.
How much? No.
You know exactly what that means, Patrick. For
Context
God's
is
sake, you're
everything.
bloody British. You know what
I
that
got it,
means, all right?
I got it.
Alicia,
Yes?
you nodded at one point
Oh,
when Dave was speaking.
She does that once or twice.
I interrupt too much, that's what I do.
Not at all.
No, I think there are a lot of clues that at whatever level you are starting to reach the edge, and that is you get incredible amounts of fluctuation. Complex systems are preeminently able to do compensatory change. That's a term that Dan Brooks talks, he's an ecologist. But David Woods, your colleague at Ohio State, says the opposite of that is decompensation, which I suppose is a use of the psychology term of decompensation. And that is, you start to be too slow to respond to a challenge, and your responses start being too stale. And so those are indications that you are starting not to be able to
so
adapt.
those are indications,
So those are
but what Dave seemed to be suggesting was that you also need provocations to enhance that awareness.
It's a thing we call anticipatory awareness. You need to trigger people to be aware that things are different, and they won't do that without extreme provocation.
And you almost need to also, in an organization, I mean, you never hear of new news, truly new news, through an established channel.
Yep.
Because unless you're a politician, you do not build a bridge to nowhere. And you know, in a similar way, I can't remember who I said this once, but it's wonderful. It is impossible for a person to make a list of things that would never occur to him.
Sounds like Borges.
And so you have to, so are there ways, you know, there may be things in your salespeople's call reports, or you may bring in provocateurs, or you may, but you know, in that time when things are going crazy, things are out of control, you may go into denial.
Correct.
Because you're, you know, so you may have to create, oddly, you might create structures like devil's advocates, like red teams, blue teams. There may be ways that you can do to get people to take this stuff seriously, because you're not designed, the organization is not inherently designed. I think that's probably true of societies too, that they have some of the same, you know, Greenland when the trees got, you know, chopped down, I don't know.
Questions, reflections, comments? Yes.
It's a lot to take in. So kind of dumb question. I'm just thinking, so from an organizational point of view, how about when there's official recognition of something, that change needs to happen, action has been taken, and there's a narrative. And you have the narrative built, you communicate it, and everyone says, yes, this is it. And then we go back to the office and do the old stuff. So there's discrepancy, right?
You go back to the office and
Do the old stuff.
do the old stuff. So the question, for those who can't hear it, is there's a recognition, there is a new plan or initiative that's communicated, but everybody goes back to the office and gets back into the old stuff.
Yeah. Right. So it's not like the GM or whatever, like it's not that you keep doing the same thing. You know, you're aware, and you communicate it.
Right.
But then you keep doing the same.
So the habituation, you just fall back into the habits.
I mean, this is actually a phenomenon of systems thinking. If you actually go back into the 70s and 60s, people didn't announce change initiatives. They just got on and did things, all right? And the people who actually managed the companies had come through it in an apprentice framework, so they actually knew what would work. What we saw with systems thinking, with the growth of management consultancy and the growth of business schools, is the belief that somehow or other you could direct the system. Now, people now are very cynical about this. I mean, I've lived through God knows how many change initiatives in my life. And I remember we had one with McKinsey's, and I went to see the financial director, and he said, why the hell have McKinsey's got you in the top right-hand box of the business requiring lots of investment, yeah, and no expected return? And I said, well, I've read their website, so I know what their questions mean. Yeah, I'm gaming the system, right? And what you see in organizations is, okay, so what's the current flavor of the month? Oh, it's this narrative, right? It's a misuse of the word narrative. It's generally a set of platitudes. And people just go back and say, okay, I'll just change my slide set so we're doing that. The worst thing you can possibly do in a modern organization is announce a change initiative, because it immediately triggers negative reactions. And that's what I was saying earlier. You have to, first of all, map where the hell you are before you decide where you want to go. And you have to identify what you can change in the present, which is sustainable and resilient. And you celebrate the success after you've done it, not before you've done it.
So that sounds like an answer to the front end of the question, but the back end of the question is, how do people get out of habits?
Well, I think they get out of habit. I mean, part of it is what Dave was saying is absolutely right. You cannot, you know, John Katzenbach did some really good work and built on stuff that Ed Schein had done as well about you know, cultures evolve. they have dispositionality, right? and as David was saying, what you do is you make the bad stuff harder and the good stuff easier. And you make it harder to do the behaviors that you want to change and easier to do something else. You reward people who exemplify the good behaviors, the stuff people that John Katzenbach calls pride builders. I don't know why it's a bad term to me, but their cultures are always evolving. They're revolving like organisms in response to stimuli and context, and if you can give them the right stimuli or highlight the right stimuli, they will start evolving in the direction
that sounds very
that
Pavlovian.
you want.
No, it's not, because granularity matters here. If you actually get people in very small groups with cognitive diversity to look at problems in parallel, you get massive change. The minute you aggregate it to the organization as a whole, you get conformity.
Right.
Yeah, so this is a fractal
And I have to defend
issue.
my turf if I have turf to defend.
Yeah. The minute you break it, I mean, this is the key thing on complexity. You scale a complex adaptive system by decomposition and recombination, not by imitation or goals.
So that means that you're tuning into context.
You move to lower levels of granularity, you increase the cognitive diversity, you increase the empathetic element, then people can change very quickly. I've argued for years we get the Tea Party wrong. Because actually, if you go and... I've spent time doing...
the Alice in Wonderland Tea Party?
No, the scary one in the Midwest, all right? Not the really interesting one, all right? So basically, if you go and spend time, I spend months, 2 or 3 months on ethnography in Tea Party countries. They're socialist. If you go into their communities, at the level of their community, they're deeply socialist. They look after each other, they respond for each other, the systems are self-sustaining. To attack them as right-wing is a fundamental error. Yeah, and we've got to change the granularity in which we talk about politics so we can see what's genuine in those systems and build on it.
Okay. Yes. Right. So the question is that in organizations, typically the metrics are both retrospective and abstract. They're high level.
You know, it's interesting. We're in a group where there's a lot of large companies represented, and one of the things that I've learned at the National Center for the Middle Market, where 85% of the companies are private and their revenues, and revenues between $10 million and $1 billion a year, which is a big spread, but a $100 million company is a much small, family-owned company is a much smaller beast. But I remember talking to Pankaj Gamawat of Harvard, well, he's now at ESA and NYU, but Pankaj was saying that all of our work in strategy presupposes a profit-maximizing Milton Friedman shareholder. But it might be different if the shareholder is your mother. And her incentives for the organization might be different, and it'd be interesting to think about them. And you could think about, there are companies whose incentives is, we want to live forever. We want to live for a long time. And short quarterly annual public shareholder profit maximization, and there's a lot of evidence, of course, that quarterly annual shareholder profit maximization leads you to consume your environment. But it may just be that we need to surface these other things against, of course, disincentives from Wall Street.
I think 2 comments on this. Well, 3 comments. One is that you have got this problem is that Western capitalism evolved on the assumption of infinitely available resources and growth. And we're now in a world where that isn't possible. Yeah, and that is going to require drastic change, right? The second thing, if I get more prosaic in companies, now this is 101 science, all right? I can give you the references on this. In every study of human motivation, where people are working for explicit targets, it destroys intrinsic motivation. There is absolutely 0 evidence to contradict that, but HR departments, who these days have CEOs in a Stockholm Syndrome relationship, have basically created this system of measurement which they're obsessed with. Right? Now, you don't change that overnight, and this is a key principle of what we call anthro-complexity. You basically say complexity starts with where people are, not where you would like them to be. So if they're in a situation where they're measuring everything, you give them different measures. So outcome-based targets work where things are predictable. Vector-based targets work where they're not. You still got KPIs, you just give people different measurement systems, and that's how you make the change. You're not going to change it by telling people they're wrong. You change them by saying they were right within boundaries, but there's something on the other side of the boundary.
So, but the other, sort of behind that question, I don't know if it's an accurate interpretation, but I'm hearing, I'm not powerful. I'm sitting in the middle of a system which is constructed in this way. So what the hell can I do about this? You didn't? Sorry?
I just cried in the bathroom.
Oh, you just cry in the bathroom. Right, which, helps at a personal level, may not help at any other level.
I wouldn't be sorry. Small things work, right? If you can actually make small things change which contradict the measurement system, people will pay attention to you. But they won't pay attention if you say they're wrong. So, and it's actually a Socratic technique. What you do is you introduce contradiction into the system that people have to pay attention to, and then let them respond.
Questions? Yes, sir, at the back.
Do you want to go first?
Go.
Go on, you go first.
I think it's both. That's splitting. That's a philosopher answer. It's both, because it is a challenge, because you're not simplifying things and putting them into a grid and deluding yourself into thinking there's that easy solution. But I think it's a challenge insofar as that's reality, as Dave would say. That's where we are. That's where the society is. That's where the nature is. That's where the ecosystem is. And so we had best start realizing that it matters. Jane introduced me as somebody involved in a startup company. What we're doing is looking at the spread of infectious diseases. And if there's any Zika, dengue, all of these mosquito, EEE, Lyme disease, all of these, they're the ultimate complex dynamical system because they're all very contextual. It depends on how many people there are in the neighborhood. You don't care about mosquitoes in the Everglades. I mean, they're not going to bite you, but it's all context dependent. And so whether it's the environment, whether it's the diseases, whether it's the economy, we'd better pay attention. So I think it's everywhere.
We're almost out of time. Can I ask you in turn, we'll start with Dave. Famous last words.
Okay, what we're talking about in complexity is a transdisciplinary scientific approach. And that actually means we need generalists. And the big deficiency we've got at the moment is the educational system isn't throwing out generalists, so we've got to create them. Because generalists can synthesize different knowledge bases, a collection of specialists isn't the same thing.
Okay, I just want to make a connection back to the audience, because how many people in a knowledge management or taxonomy role have come into it from somewhere else, another discipline? A lot, right? So you are already proto-transdisciplinarians and should sign up. Tom.
I had an argument with the co-author of my most recent book when I insisted on using the phrase ontological reductionism.
I wonder why.
And we got it. I won the argument. But we do have. I mean, I think that people have a natural tendency to take things apart and to try to break them down into smaller pieces, and then try to put them back together again. And to think that the world, even when it looks messy, can be put back together, and it's a jigsaw puzzle, and not an ever-changing thing. I think we have a tendency to do that from 9 to 5, and we all know it's wrong. We all know that's not the way the world works, but we think it'll get us through the day. And I think it's so. I want to echo what Dave just said about the importance of bringing people together who come from different disciplines, I mean, multidisciplinary teams, cognitively diverse teams, and also put them together with people who themselves have the kind of humanistic or social scientific background or biological background, that encourages them to see these patterns and these emergent things. Right. I think we need to develop people and encourage the growth and hire and employ and promote people who have that view of the world as a dynamic.
And then actually, if we're aware of that as a strength, is something that we can deliberately seek out, even at the personal level in the workplace.
You know, there was a famous news conference in South Vietnam. General Westmoreland was really pissed off, that's another scientific term, at David Halberstam, reporter for the New York Times. He said, "You're always looking for the hole in the donut, Halberstam," because he was always asking tough questions. And you can actually be, you know, being the person who's looking for the hole in the donut is not always an uncomfortable role to play. And we need to be grown up enough in our organizations and our lives to put up with David Halberstam.
Alicia.
And I'll finish by supporting that with another example from biology. Biologists, going back to Buzz Holling, talked about the difference between stability and resilience. And we always seemed to have favored stability. But stability means a very narrow range of adaptability. It's like an oak tree. It doesn't move much, but once the wind gets too high, it'll go down. And the perfect example is the Great Lakes region, which was stable for millennia, and now all of a sudden is very fragile and has serious problems. And the discovery of the ecologists has been because the microdiversity in the Great Lakes region is not too high. So the more microdiversity you have at the lower level, the higher the resilience and the adaptability of the overall system. So all the talk about diversity hiring and diversity promotion and all of this can either be interpreted as, oh, it's one more politically correct way of looking at it, or you can look at it, hey, nature tells you that if you don't, and I'll close with this. I just finished a paper that I'm calling for more degeneracy. I love that because
that's my dispositionality, so that works.
There you go. There you go. The thing is, for some weird reason, that term, which has always negative connotations in culture, in biology means that different configurations will have the same functionality. For example, a whole bunch of different amino acids can code for the same protein, for the same function. And so if you have one amino acid per protein, you're in trouble. Because if that amino acid dies or gets killed off or whatever, that protein's gone. The reason we have the capacity to, our dispositionality is to be capable of evolving. And the only way you guarantee that is by having microdiversity.
And we are reaching the boundary between one session and the next session.
Yeah, but all of you who are not signed up to come to complexity, aren't you disappointed now? Because we're going to have a hell of a conversation tonight and tomorrow. So please thank our panel for doing a wonderful job.